Well, if you've read the book, then you might have some issues with Dune Part Two. I know, but this is a movie, Mr. Aussie Critic, so judge it based on that. Or the classic, but Mr. Aussie Critic, the changes help set up Dune Messiah, blah blah blah. The book as written is far superior, and Dune Part Two is a crap experience by contrast. But it is still a good experience on its own as a film. It's a 7.5 to 8 out of 10, just like Part 1, which is to say it's mostly solid with a few very good highlights that elevate it above other pictures in the big budget sci-fi genre. But it must be said that by the holy and true name of God, Allah, Zeus and Thor, henceforth known as the Four Gods, if you know, you know, this film was overhyped and is overrated.
I would say that's that, Mattress Man.
Now, if you're a huge fan of Part 2, then this review is not for you because it was to me an intolerable slog at times with some very mediocre writing that continually violated the show don't tell rule. This was particularly egregious as it treated the audience as if they were dim-witted children who couldn't follow a complex story. I can't abide by that paternalistic storytelling and will be pointing out those flaws. In the past, I would have criticized the intelligence of those who lavish praise on Dune Part 2, but I've come to learn that everyone believes themselves a genius, even when their life is a testimony to mediocrity, unlike mine, which is brilliant and a shining light to humanity.
Sure, Dan.
So let's dive straight in with a few strengths and weaknesses. An untethered Timothy Chalamet in the third act and Austin Butler were very good as Paul Atreides and Fade Rautha. I could watch those two young stars go back and forth for hours, and we were all very fortunate to see them together in the final knife duel. You can't deny that actors elevate one another, and Chalamet and Butler helped get the other to heights just shy of something truly great. Here's hoping they'll keep pushing one another along with healthy competition in another film or just in general as part of the industry, because I was hooked. Unfortunately, Chalamet does play Paul Atreides like Private Abilene from Southland Tales for the first and second act of the film. It's the typical prophet, seer, breathy delivery as one is trying to appear grand, but it always comes across as ponderous instead. The real MVP in the acting department was Rebecca Ferguson, especially when she moves into the Mother Superior role. Her delivery of Fremen dialogue was soul-stirring, and the gravitas she brought to this role, which often saw her covered head to toe in ceremonial garb, helped ensure the role remained relevant even with reduced screen time. A second strength was that during fight sequences, Villeneuve opts for longer takes with solid blocking as opposed to a Bayhem approach full of insane carnage. This was appreciated as we are drawn into Arrakis and the close quarters fighting style favoured in the Dune universe. Anytime a shot runs for more than 4 seconds and requires the team to move camera and cast to convey a multitude of visual information is kino in my opinion. Unfortunately, this approach is undone during dialogue scenes, which devolve into a series of shot reverse shots inside of shallow focus frames. Bokeh is nice, guys, it's very lovely, but cinema is not talking heads, and worse, talking heads is just another way of saying dull, 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 and exists purely for the sake of exposition. Here's two characters talking about something the audience needs to understand rather than as genuine people would speak. And here's another scene like that, and another, and yes, at no point do they ever really interact physically with the environment or one another, and nor is there visual subtext within the frame. But we'll make up for it with a good fight scene to offset the tedium. This is a great sin though, as you're taking all the hard work of the set and costume design team and reducing it to sludge. That being said, a big visual strength in Dune Part 2 is whenever the worms are brought out. The second act worm riding scene and the final catastrophic battle were phenomenal big screen experiences, if a little short in the latter's case. We don't get anything even remotely close to the epic ride of the Rohirrim.
Ride the ruin, and the world ends
And yes, I wish I could have played that scene in its entirety. What a banger. Dune Part 2 doesn't even get close to that level, so it's ridiculous to consider it equal to any of the Lord of the Rings films. As mentioned, the tedium is dialed up to 11 in Part 2, particularly the relationship between Paul and Cheney, as the actors have no chemistry together, and the time spent on Paul dragging his feet towards his messianic position. These moments hurt the first and second acts, as none of the writers know how to convey these ideas or emotions effectively and in a propulsive manner. Furthermore, we have a truly great evil wrought upon the Dune books with the MCU tier comedy. Stilgar cracking wise before the worm riding event, or Chani talking about boys with her girlfriend were intolerably lame and cringe-inducing. Unsurprisingly, the writing team are unfunny men, so the notion that they believe themselves capable of inserting humor into their scripts is in its own way laughable. The only element of dialogue which comes across as interesting involves the Bene Gesserit and Harkonnen political maneuvering in the second act. Everything there is solid, if still bogged down with exposition. For unfortunately, multiple characters reiterate their viewpoint multiple times. I jotted down a few examples after the credits rolled so I wouldn't forget on my way back home. Firstly, Paul says he's afraid of the Southern fundamentalists turning him into the Messiah, and then we also have Chani and Gurney repeat that point at different junctures in the film. This leaves you sitting there thinking, we know already, he said it once, why do so again? Secondly, Princess Irulan says Fade Rautha, he's psychotic. Then guess what happens, class? Yes, you're right, the very next scene has Fade acting psychotic. That's brilliant writing, I didn't see it coming. You were told and then you were shown as if you're stupid, instead of just showing his behavior and trusting that you can figure out his nature. Finally, both Baron Harkonnen and Bene Gesserit explain that if people discovered the Emperor's involvement in the attack on Arrakis, then the great houses would align under the Harkonnens against him. Once more, we have information being conveyed multiple times when you only needed to do it once, and ideally visually rather than verbally. Exposition is necessary for just about any film, but I think especially for a sci-fi or fantasy picture. The issue is that it should be one and done. Provide the necessary data and then move on to genuine dialogue. The problem is that it's repeated multiple times. Did I already say that? These multiple examples helped me to reach the conclusion that the best moments are when we stick to the book, and the worst are when Villeneuve and co try to write their own story. Finally, good dialogue is when the meaning of a scene or a character's motivation is revealed through a conversation about something else entirely. If you want to see what that looks like, go and watch the Sicilian scene again from True Romance. A conversation about one thing tells us everything we need to know about these two men and how this scene is going to play out. Quentin Tarantino can genuinely write. Villeneuve cannot. Now, I walked out of the theatre thinking to myself, Dune Part 1 was better, but I do struggle to put my finger on just why that is. The pacing seemed better for one thing, and the dialogue was crisper, and that didn't occur here in Part 2 in my opinion. But it's just a gut feeling for the most part. One possible explanation for my misgivings about Dune Part 2 is that Part 1 should have ended where Part 2 of the Dune book finishes, the book itself being broken into 3 parts. Then Part 2 of the film should have just covered Part 3 of the book, as this begins years later and introduces new characters and concepts. As it was the film, Dune Part 2 has the gargantuan task of finishing up Paul's introduction into Fremen culture and then jumping forward to cover off the Harkonnens' failures against the Fremen before the big finale. This results in clunky pacing that I found so frustrating, and so a potential resolution would have been to extend the length of Dune Part 1. But I don't think Villeneuve could have achieved this outcome because it would have meant making a 3-hour-plus film in the first place, which was perhaps too risky a proposition for everyone involved. Anyway, it is what it is, so we'll keep it to this. Is Dune Part 2 a good movie? Yes, absolutely, and I'd recommend you go see it. Is it one of the greatest films of all time as per IMDb? Fuck no. Are you insane? Get a grip, you moron. Thanks for watching.